Open a book and open up your mind. Open a book and open up your mind. Open a book and open up your mind.
Morning, Dragonettes. I'm back from the holiday craziness. And reason I was gone, my husband built me a brand new computer for my Christmas gift. And here are the pictures. I'm a big brony, as you can see, and this is my workspace. It's where I do all my recording. And I think I have a very cozy little corner to work from, too. What I need is to get up some soundproofing behind me so that hopefully I sound better. And I could use a better microphone as well. I would love to get a Yeti. But that's for later. Right now, I am just loving my computer. It glows. I love it. Oh my gosh. I'm a huge lover of glowy, shiny things, and my husband can attest to this, which is why he got me this shiny computer. Well, I hope you all had a very happy Thanksgiving, survived Black Friday, and now on to business. While thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, a lot of things came to mind. Some of them will be better discussed later. What I decided I wanted to talk about today is the subject of religion and gods, since that's what we've just been reading about. Not only that, but even if you've read something before, different things may stick out to you when you reread a piece. And I noticed some hints Duncan left early on that we can extrapolate a theory from. If you were paying attention, which I really wasn't the first time I read this, the people of Pandemia have a religion which seems to be a lot like the Catholic Church. And Catholicism is the largest Christian religion in the world, so it's not difficult to see why he used that as a structure for Pandemia's religion, especially when you couple it with the recent scandals. The Catholic Church is used a lot for this sort of thing. And like Duncan does in this book, the church organization is very flawed, as shown by the spiteful Mother Unonini, who I'd say is a great example of what's wrong in the Pandemian church. And by extension, the Catholic Church here, since that's the nearest equivalent in our world. The Catholic Church, however, it's a very easy target. And this has been going on in our culture for so many years, it's almost ingrained. It's easy to understand and dismiss the criticism and that part of the narrative. After all, the Catholic Church these days has become the whipping boy of religions, basically. It's become the standard thing to do to have a character or organization that's representative of the Catholic Church to be depicted as corrupt or in an otherwise negative light. It's become so commonplace that we instantly make that connection between the Pandemian religion, which in Mother Unonini is shown in a very harsh light, and Catholicism. The only difference is that the church seems to be female-run, or at the very least is welcoming of women in its main hierarchy, which is another common trope in sci-fi and fantasy. The really interesting twist Dave Duncan gave to his religion, however, is the fact that not only does the church worship many gods instead of just one, they're actually beings that really will come down and talk with humanity if they see the need to. This makes Enos one of the typical prophesied chosen one, which is extremely common in fantasy. But reading about the encounter, we also learn a little about the beings that the ordinary Pandemians worship. For that matter, the mere fact that the gods will appear and interact with mere mortals is something that's common in fantasy, but not quite as common as having a chosen one, which is common as dirt, and says something about the Princess Enos' destiny. It's important enough to the well-being of Pandemia that the gods have taken notice, and most people will take that as not an insignificant thing. I was trained to be an English teacher, and I can be a real grammar Nazi sometimes. No nouns for you.
You know what? Has anyone ever told you look exactly like Al Pacino? You know, Scent of a Woman? Hoo-ah! Hoo-ah!
Very good. Very good. You know something? No soup for you! Come back 1 year. Next!
But it wasn't when I first read this book, and I didn't notice this at the time. Pandemians always refer to gods not only as non-gender specific instead of using the pronouns of he or she, but the Pandemians also refer to their gods in the plural, using they or them. And this use of pronouns says a lot if you're paying attention. And that's one of the cooler things about Duncan's writing. He loves to put these little hints in. So what can we extrapolate just from the pronoun use is fascinating. And it's something I want you all to keep in mind as we go. What does Pandemian pronoun use in relation to their pantheon say about these gods? Finally, as we've seen, Mother Unanini's spiteful and grasping and really mean for no good reason. So she's also easy to ignore and leave behind as the story progresses. However, we shouldn't just dismiss the entire scene out of hand, and even store it in memory for later. Those who read a lot of fantasy and understand the tropes and conventions know this and will remember the scene and what was said. For those of you who don't really read much fantasy, this scene is kind of a Chekhov's gun. For those who don't know, I'll explain what this is. Chekhov, not this Chekhov, but this Chekhov. Anton Chekhov was a Russian short story author and playwright. He was a master of the short story form. In fact, he's considered one of the greatest short story authors of all time, and his plays still get produced today. And if you haven't read any of his stories or plays in your English class, then your teacher is really doing you a disservice, in my opinion. And Chekhov's become known for the belief that nothing unimportant should be mentioned in a story or placed on a stage. He said, remove everything that has no relevance to the story. If you say in the first chapter that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter, it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. It's wrong to make promises you don't mean to keep. Here, the gun can be a literal gun, or it can simply be a bit of superfluous dialogue or a descriptive passage that doesn't really connect to the rest of the work. And his concept is what's now become known as Chekhov's gun. For our purposes, the scene of Enos' meeting the god is the gun. The god has made promises for Duncan. The prophecy about Enos needing to remember love that the author must fulfill, if not in this volume, then at least before the end of the series. In conclusion, these are just a few of the things I want everyone listening to be aware of as we go forward in the story. I find having ways to connect parts of the story to later actions in the story, or comparing ideas and actions in the story to what happens in real life, part of what's known as active reading, which just boils down to paying attention. All right, with that said, on with the story. King Hollandar was just telling Enos she can't be running around by herself. He sighed and patted her shoulder. This has to stop, Enos. You're growing up. You're not a child anymore. You can't run around by yourself, nor with stable boys and scullery maids, clamoring after birds' eggs, digging clams. I've been neglecting you, he chuckled. Perhaps Mayo thinks I've been neglecting her. I haven't seen her in years, or else she was sending me a message. Message? He nodded. A message that my beautiful daughter should not be wandering around town by herself. No, Mayo doesn't expect 3.5 Imperials. That was better. Much better. Her father chuckled. I'm very tempted to send the guard down to arrest her for extortion and then sentence her to stay for dinner. But the neighbors would gossip. Did she have any other quality stuff? No. Oh my gosh. Typical sad widower wanting company. And since he was involved somewhat with mail before, I really can't fault the king. With sudden excitement, Enos remembered what the god had said. Only one other silk, father. It had flowering trees on it. Apples, she said. Do apples really grow from flowers? But she has a drooly turquoise satin, and 3 soft linens, and a roll of silver mohair. He laughed. I was going to send you out with your aunt this afternoon, but perhaps I'll come as well. If Dr. Sagorn will excuse me for a little while, I shall visit with my old friend Mayo. She's a widow now. I expect she's lonely. But you can have all of those, and more besides, all the fine dresses and gowns we can make or find for you. Father? You mean it? But why? He smiled sadly. I wasn't going to tell you yet, but I suppose I must, because you have to leave Krasnagar. 6. I loved a maiden, oh, I loved a maiden long ago. I left my land, I left my kin, I left my all, her heart to win. Maiden, oh, long ago. Jalon's voice floated through the great hall like flower petals. Enos felt very shivery listening to it. She thought of all the glory of the god she had seen that morning. She thought of moonlight on snow, of the string of pearls she was wearing, and of white gulls against blue sky. Great beauty always made her shivery, and she had never known such singing. Any other minstrel she had heard was a honking goose compared to Jalon. The hall was full of people, yet there was no sound except the tremulous throb of the harp and a gloriously clear tenor voice floating under the high rafters. Flower petals! Enos was sitting with her father and his guests at the high table, on the dais at one end of the great hall. More townsfolk and the senior castle staff flanked tables on both sides. At the far end, the lesser folk sat on the floor in front of the big fireplaces. Sounds like the best place to be. Kind of like going to the Globe for a Shakespeare play when Shakespeare was alive. The stones above them were black with grease and the smoke of centuries, and the high rafters overhead were black also. Many a winter's day Enos had shivered at this table, staring wistfully along the length of the hall to the leaping flames, hissing and spluttering as grease dripped into them from creaking spits. A princess envying servants. But today the hearths were dark and bare, and the hall was hot, not cold. The sun loved Krasnagar in the summer and would not leave it. Men fell down from exhaustion before the sun did, and after an hour or so it came smiling back, ready for another endless day. So the sun was still shining in the windows, laying sparkling bridges of light across the room in the floating dust. I gave her gold and rubies too. I gave my all, her heart to woo. Maiden, oh. It was warm up there at the high table with her father and Aunt Cade and all the distinguished guests who had been rounded up from the town at very short notice to hear this minstrel, and perhaps to say goodbye to their Princess Inosolon. No, never mind that. Aunt Cade had dug out her ancient lapis lazuli velvet, which made her seem plumper and shorter than ever, and was usually worn only at Winterfest. It was much too hot a garment for this weather, and her face was pink and shiny as she smiled contentedly at her guests. She'd had her hair blue rinsed, Smiling at the thought of Kinvale? No. Think of that tomorrow. Sounds not only like Scarlett O'Hara, but sounds like her aunt is the typical blue-haired old lady. Mistress Maylorn was there, beaming happily, perhaps musing on all the wonderful fabrics she had sold to the court that afternoon, and all of them for less than a single imperial, as the king had predicted. He and she had laughed together like old friends. Well, they were old friends. Her father did look tired, almost as if he were sitting in the shadow when everyone around him was in sunshine. There were merchants there with their wives and a few ship captains, and the bishop and the school teachers, old Condorall cupping his ear, tears running in his wrinkles, Chancellor Yaltari, and Master Porgano. There were few of the castle staff, for so many were away in the hills, and especially not many young folk, but she could see Lynn, who had broken his arm cutting peat of all things. How could he have managed that? And Kell and Ito and Penn and Rapp, of course. They were all sitting on the floor at the far end, near the great fireplace, small, wide-eyed children at the front, cross-legged or hugging their knees, entranced by the music. The junior staff, like Rapp, gathered behind him. As always, the palace dogs had clustered as close to Rapp as they could get. Before the children, flanked by the lesser tables, the center of the hall was empty except for one chair, and on that chair the minstrel sat and pleated moonbeams. I loved a maiden, oh, I loved a maiden long ago. I traveled land, I traveled sea, I traveled all by her to be. Maiden, oh, long ago. And actually, if you're looking at this, this song is kind of a bit of foreshadowing about Rapp and Enos's journey later. Mother Unanini was not there. Mother Unanini was under the care of the physicians, resting in a dark room on a light diet, and Enos could not help but think that there was a small good in that evil, and the thought made her feel guilty. She shouldn't feel guilty. Mother Unanini is crap. The fearsome Dr. Sagorn was not there either, another small good. Even if he was an old friend of her father's, his glittery eagle gaze and beak nose still frightened her, and she was quite happy that he had pleaded travel weariness to excuse his absence. Jalon's song ended, and the hall exploded with applause, clapping and cheering and the drumming of heels on stones. The minstrel rose and bowed to the king and then to the rest of the company. Then he came back up to his seat at the high table. "Your throat must be dry, minstrel," her father said. "A little, sire, and the audience could use a rest also." "That I do not believe, steward." Jalon gratefully accepted a new tankard and said something about fine northern beer before quaffing it. All around the hall, conversations began to poke up like spring flowers through snow, and the spell he had painted faded away. "The Emperor has appointed a new marshal of the armies, minstrel?" demanded one of the pompous burghers. Jalon smiled vaguely. "The old one died, didn't he?" The burgher made an impatient noise. "But the new one, is he warlike?" Enos could not recall the burgher's name. He looked like a rooster with red wattles and hair that stuck up. He had perhaps drunk a little too much of the fine northern beer. "I expect so," Jalon said. "They usually are, aren't they?" "And the Witch of the West is dead?" another asked. "Ding dong, the witch is dead. Witch, old witch, the wicked witch." The minstrel looked blank and then said, "Yes," uncertainly. This dwarf who's replaced her, what do you know of him? Nothing. Yes, nothing. One of the stately matrons frowned at him severely. Then the four now consist of 3 warlocks and only 1 witch? Isn't that so? Only one of the wardens is a woman? Brightwater? Jalon looked even more blank. Her omnipotent Somthrum? She's a woman, isn't she? There was a long, puzzled pause. Then a little Barity sailor said, She died years ago, before I was born. The minstrel sighed. I'm afraid politics is not a great interest of mine, master. Jalon had come from Hub itself, capital of the empire. The honored guests were eager for news and gossip and had been firing questions at him all evening, but he never seemed to have any answers. He was a very sweet young man, Enos thought, but as insubstantial as a morning mist. She wondered how he ever found his way from castle to castle or down to down. He was probably always froing when he should be toing, she thought, and chuckled to herself with a glance in the direction of Rap. We have heard rumors of much dragon damage in the southern provinces, another burgher proclaimed, meaning it as a question to Jalon. On Kith especially? Oh, the minstrel said. I'm afraid I must have missed that. The worthies of Krasnagar exchanged glances of exasperation. What sort of gowns are the ladies wearing in the Empire these days, Master Jalon? That was Aunt Kate, who must be worrying about all those fabrics, and how many of them she could purloin for her own use, where she could find enough seamstresses to sew them all in the few days before departure. Very high waists, Jalon said firmly, flowing out like trumpets at the floor, with barely short trains, puffed sleeves at the shoulders, and sleeves tight at the top, flaring at the wrist. Lace cuffs. Necklines are high, with lace trim also. Floral prints are very popular, in cotton or silk. The table reacted with stunned silence to this unexpected note of authority. Enos noticed that her father was grinning. Master Jalon is a fine artist also, the king remarked. Would there possibly be time for you to paint my daughter's portrait before you leave, Jalon? Jalon studied Enos for a moment. Had I a lifetime to spend, I could hardly do justice to such beauty, sire. Enos felt herself blushing, and everyone else laughed. They did not have to laugh quite so hard, she thought. The minstrel turned back to the king. If I can lay my hands on materials, sire, they might not be readily available here, but a drawing, certainly. It would be a labor of love. Could you sketch us some of these gowns you have just described, Master Jalon? Aunt Kate inquired, blinking eagerly. Of course, Your Highness. Aunt Kate beamed with evident relief and turned to Mistress Mailorn to ask her opinions on seamstresses. Enos looked longingly at the young folk beyond the tables. They were chattering and laughing. Rap was telling a story, Lynn topping it. What use was it to be a princess if you could not do as you pleased? Why did she have to be trapped up here with all these stuffy old folks? Quietly, she eased her chair back. Aunt Cade's head flicked around. Enos, I thought I might... Let her, the king said softly. He did not say, it is the last time, but she thought that he was thinking it. Gratefully, Enos rose, smiled with politeness around the guests, and muttered something inaudible. Then she hurried across the so empty center of the hall to the group on the floor. The young ones saw her coming and started to open a path for her, and they cleared an opening all the way to Lynn and Rap. Everybody knows! Rap shoved at a couple of dogs, and Lynn heaved himself aside, one-armed. Now, why did they all assume she would want to sit just there? Again, they know. But she did. As she settled down, he turned to look at her, and his big gray eyes grew even bigger at the sight of the pearls. They smiled doubtfully at each other. "How is the man-at-arms-ing?" she whispered. He grinned sheepishly. "Boring." She smiled. "Good. In that case, I'm sorry I was so nasty to your rap." He turned a little pink, looked down at his knees, and said, "Then we can still be fiends?" They sniggered in unison. She put her hand on the floor next to his. His hand slipped over hers. No one would notice. He had big, strong hands, warm and calloused. Man's hands. Yes, he was taller. It had not been the boots, and his worn old doublet was tight across the shoulders. A friendly smell of horses always hung around Rap. "Running around with stable boys," her father had said. "Rap, I'm going away." She had not meant to mention that problem. He looked at her with surprise all over his plain pudding face, though it was a lot less pudding than it used to be. "South," she said quickly, "to Kinvale, to learn how to be a lady, with Aunt Kate on the next ship." Enos bit her lip and stared at the distant high table. The hall had gone rather misty. His hand tightened on hers. "For how long?" "A year." Enos took a deep breath and made a big effort to be regal. "You see, the Duke is a sort of relative, Duke Angilki of Kinvale. Aunt Kate was married to his uncle, and my great-grandfather's sister was his... Oh, I forget. And Esau had 3 sons. One became king here after him, one went south and became Duke of Kinvale, and one went to Nordland. Calcor, the Thane of Gark, is descended from him, but it's much more complicated." She stopped because Rap would not be interested, and it was not very nice to talk of all those ancestors when he didn't have any. Well, none that he knew of, she decided. He must have had just as many as she had, only not of noble blood. Her father said that the branches of her family tree were all knotted. There were not many noble families in the North Country, so they tended to intermarry every few generations, as soon as it was decent. Eniso had had 3 sons. Apparently that was important. "When you're Queen of Krasnagar, then I shall be your sergeant-at-arms," Rap said. "Oh, Rap, I would rather have you as master of horse, I think." "Sergeant-at-arms," he insisted. "Master of horse." Pause. "Both," they said together and laughed together. "Jinx!" Apparently, Jalon was not going to start singing again just yet. For a few minutes, nothing more was said, and Enos realized she was sitting and smiling like a dummy at Rap, and he was smiling just as stupidly back at her. Why should she be smiling in a time like this? "Girl, it's 'cause you love him already." Go away? To horrible Kinvale? What good was it to be a princess if you had to do things like that? And creepy old Sagorn had hinted that she might start a war if she ever fell in love with a man. "I saw a god today." She had not meant to mention that either. In fact, she had promised her father she would not. But Rap's solemn gray eyes were waiting for her to explain. So she did, and she told him about Dr. Sagorn and the silk and everything that had happened. She was not sure why she did, but she felt better afterwards. After all, Rap could be trusted not to blabber to others, and no one was more level-headed than Rap. He listened carefully and then ignored the god. And that is our timer. Thank you for joining the adventure today. Please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified about new videos. If you like my content, please join me at my Patreon page. Link is below. This is Tarynn, and until our next adventure, keep reading.